Recording in progress.
Good afternoon. Thank you all for being here. I hope everyone is doing all right. We're going to kick off this broadcast of the World Bank, Recovering Growth, Building Dynamic Post-COVID Economies Under Budgetary Constraints. That is the name of the report about which we will speak today. This is a part of the analysis that is done every semester by the World Bank for Latin America. My name is Jessica Beaumont. I am a communications specialist of this institution, and I greet you from Mexico. And in Washington, we have with us Chief Economist of the World Bank for Latin America and the Caribbean, Bill Maloney. Good afternoon. Good afternoon, Jessica. Thank you very much for being here with us. I'm happy to see you. Before starting, I would just like to tell everyone that we have nearly 100 journalists throughout the region of Latin America and Caribbean taking part. Now, let me explain what the dynamic of this press conference is going to be. First, there's going to be a brief description of the main findings of this report, and then we will go into the Q&A session. I would also like to remind everyone that this broadcast is being done in Spanish, English, Portuguese, and French. You can choose your language using or clicking on the icon for interpretation at the bottom of your screen. Now you can follow along with the hashtag PerspectivasALC. Hashtag PerspectivasALC. Now, this report provides an overview of the economic recovery in Latin America, how it's shaping up in a post-COVID scenario, and how those economies that are within a context of very weak recovery. We're also going to talk about economic forecasts for countries, and we will also examine some sectors which will be key to drive growth in Latin America and the Caribbean. And Bill, now, if we could just move on to your presentation, and I would start with this question. 1 year after the beginning of this pandemic, and according to the report, how are Latin American Caribbean countries going, and what are the economic prospects for the region? You have the floor, Bill. Thank you, Jessica, and good afternoon, everyone. The good news is that with a more accelerated rate of vaccination and fewer deaths caused by COVID, the region is slowly emerging from the crisis and growing once again. That said, despite the fact that some emerging sectors, new emerging sectors, recovery has been weaker than what was forecast. We're looking at 6.3% for 2021, which is insufficient to make up for the 6.7% loss of 2020. Now, obviously, some countries are growing faster than others, but on average, we are not making up for lost ground. Forecasts for 2022 and 2023 are looking at a under 3% growth rate, which is insufficient to respur the economies and to bring down poverty. It's also important to point out that these forecasts are not much higher than the low growth rates of the last decade, in which we grew much less than the rest of the world. Social costs wrought by the pandemic have been devastating. Employment dropped by 20%, and it has not yet recovered or reached its prior level, with the exception of Brazil. Poverty rose to some of the highest rates in the last decade in all of the countries of the region. Throughout the region, young people lost at least a year or more than a year of education in the long term. This is going to cost them in terms of their economic success. Now, as far as the growth rates, we're looking at rates higher than what was foreseen for the prior decade. Now, socially and economically speaking, we should see faster rates. The good news is that changes can be made, enabling faster growth. But given the cost of tackling the pandemic, we're going to have to do this within a context of tight fiscal situation, just as the title of our report suggests. Now, with these forecasts, you've already said a little bit, but what would be the conditions for the countries of the region to grow faster in 2020? Also thinking about the fact that there can be new waves of COVID. Growth is not going to be automatic. There are many factors that influence that. Generally speaking, the international environment is favorable, but that could change. Obviously, any resurgence of the virus in our region will slow down the economy. Our private sector is facing high indebtedness, keeping companies from investing and thus spurring the economy further. Now, we know that there's been an increase in sovereign debt, and that also holds back growth. Internationally speaking, inflationary pressures worldwide can lead to an increase of interest rates, which in turn would make it that much more difficult for the region to get money from the international markets. As we've seen, obviously, there are always changes in the fortunes of the main economies of the world, and that can also have an effect on our region. Well, what can we do to revert this low growth trend? Well, yes, I do think there's some things that can be done, but once again, we have to keep in mind the context of a tight fiscal space. Governments have the historic opportunity to make an effort to use more effectively their fiscal resources to push forward a reform agenda on issues such as infrastructure, education, energy policy. Some ideas we could consider in three general areas are, first, on the expenditure side, to make better use of public expenditures, reducing inefficiencies in procurement processes and transfers. That can bring costs down significantly. These inefficiencies rise to 4% of the GDP taken together. That's very high, and that can be brought down. Second, to reallocate resources to those projects that can bring more social benefits. I can give you three examples. To bring down the cost of subsidizing energy with the programs that geared toward the most vulnerable populations. Subsidies are usually very costly, and money saved can be used to invest in infrastructure, green investments, or other needs. Another example is to use social expenditures to bring down our human capital deficit in many ways. But those are just two examples. For example, to make use of technology in teaching, that's not very expensive, but more can be done to enhance the effectiveness of teachers and to promote short programs, what in the US we call I forgot the term, community colleges, to endow students with those skills that the labor market looks for. Third, to make sure that our scarce investments in innovation be of high quality and relevant for the productive sector. Three, to increase the state's revenues. We could research different ways of broadening the tax base. This is something we also go into in the report, and there's another study on that being released in March. There are ways of doing that that don't seem to negatively affect growth too much. Now, if we make progress in these three areas and in other areas, much can be done. And what the report tries to put on the table as to what our agenda ought to be. Now, moving on to the Q&A session from journalists throughout the region. But before kicking off this part, join our conversation again at the hashtag Perspectiva ALC. Now, the first question, Alberto Liesmacher asks, is it possible to know how much time will take for Latin American economies to resume the growth levels from before COVID-19, despite the fact that countries' GDPs have shown modest growth in the period before the pandemic? That is the first question. And I'll go ahead and move on to the second question. What are the most urgent measures that need to be taken to help countries recover from the crisis caused by the pandemic? I thank both of you. Now, as Humberto suggests, the problem isn't just to overcome pre-COVID or to go beyond the pre-COVID rates. We have a forecast for 2022 at 2.8%. 2022, 2023, we have already surpassed 2010, 2019 growth, the average of which was 2.2% growth, whereas world growth was 3.1%. Now, the challenge, in my view, isn't to go back to where we were before the crisis, but rather to look forward to see how we can raise the region's growth rate beyond historic rates. So the challenge lies in how to diversify economies, to deepen the sophistication of our industries, leveraging any comparative advantage that we may have. By way of example, natural resources. We can see as Norway, a country that has high-tech industries with despite its focus on petroleum, but this addiction to natural resources isn't always the answer. In industry, we have to find ways to make our industrial sector more productive, more advanced, more competitive in the world market, and to provide jobs for our workers that are more skill intensive. Now, the best way to overcome poverty and to improve the quality of lives of our people is by so doing. Now, to have more resources, revenues from the high cost of prices of commodities in the short term, that's great. We can take that money, invest in human capital. We can invest in our industry, but in and of itself, it's not a long-term solution. So, as I said, we combine investments in infrastructure, in education, in the business environment, and projecting ourselves into the world market. That's the only long-term way that we are going to fight effectively against poverty. Thank you. Now, Carolina asks from the Daily Economist. Her question is that the region went through a certain growth with the 2000 spike in commodity prices, but it seemed that we did not avail ourselves of that opportunity to tackle or overcome old, long-standing problems such as poverty. So what can we do to keep that from happening again? Well, in the short term, as I said, it may be that there could be another super cycle of commodities, and that would be a good thing, because that would give us more resources. But we have to know how to invest those resources in long-term projects in industry, in the human capital of our citizens. In and of itself, just to distribute the windfalls, the revenue of the commodity boom, that is a short-term fix that does not solve the long-term problem of how to improve our workers' productivity. That is a much thornier problem that calls for many and varied reforms. Thank you. Now, Alfonso Fernandez from the US asks from the EPI agency, what are the possible consequences of sustained inflation and a rise in interest rates in the US? And what countries of the region are most at risk should that happen? Well, obviously, a spike in interest rates will make loans more expensive for our governments. It makes it harder to manage the debt. And as always, those countries that could be most harmed by this depends on their indebtedness and their position in the market. We have to be very careful on how we answer that. Now, from Mexico, Mr. Avila from the Expansion Group says, what has to be implemented to achieve homogeneous economic recovery that's swifter, and what is being done to ensure access to vaccines against COVID-19 in the poorest countries? Now, if you'd allow, I would just like to add another question to that from Panama, because I think it relates to the prior question. Vaccination in countries in a post-pandemic world, what is likely to happen with vaccination programs? Well, the focus on vaccinations is on mark, of course. It's absolutely necessary for us to expand vaccination as quickly as possible. After a slow start, these vaccination campaigns are being sped up in the region, and 50% of the population has received at least one dose, although we see a lot of variability among countries. Some have nearly 75% people being vaccinated with their first dose, such as Chile and Ecuador. Others barely 20. When we speak of a homogeneous recovery, we have to first make sure that those countries with the lowest vaccination levels receive the vaccines they need, and that they be swiftly distributed. The World Bank does have a $20 billion program for vaccinations and to stand up distribution systems, and the bank has also backed 40 countries with $10 billion to help them respond to this health emergency. Now, from Panama, how much money does World Bank have for economic recovery in Latin America and the Caribbean? Of that amount, how much is earmarked for Latin America? Good question. Obviously, just to refer briefly to Central America, Central America is coming back to its prior levels of growth. Before the pandemic, had been growing for 3 decades at 4.5% per year. just slightly lower than Asian rates. The pandemic there has had the same impact as throughout the region. And so Central America is now facing the same internal challenges of infrastructure, education, trying to insert itself in the global or world market. Same problems the rest of the world faces, despite the fact that it's thought that this year the region will grow by 5.6%. Now, as regards how many resources the World Bank has, I don't know the exact figure, but the World Bank is helping in areas such as bringing down intra-regional barriers to trade, reducing the time and cost of crossing borders. I think that's a positive step to help economies grow, but I don't have the exact figure. From the Bahamas, we have a question from Chester from The Guardian. Much has been said about the sovereign debts in the region, including the Bahamas. What does the World Bank say regarding the economic recovery of these countries and how the consequences of COVID should be dealt with?
Right. So I'm going to do this in English because Chester is from an English-speaking country, I think. The question of managing sovereign debt is on everybody's mind. We saw an increase in sovereign debt in the region of about 15 percentage points, which for a year and a half is a lot. As he's suggesting, we have to be very careful about that. Some countries had a fair amount of room to absorb this kind of increase. Others had much higher levels to begin with, and those are the ones that we have to be especially attentive to going forward. At this point, there's no one size fits all. I think we need to look at a variety of different ways to manage that debt, including reducing it. And we can talk about things like debt for environment time swaps and things like that in the context of climatic agenda. But I would say at a basic level, this is one area that we need to be very closely following, just because the amount suddenly jumped so much, and in the context with international interest rates potentially rising, it could become a problem.
Thank you, Bill. The next question is from Japan Case de Jamaica, de la televisión de Jamaica, y dice: now,
in the context of the most economies of the region depend on a few key industries, how important would it be to diversify these economies to buffer the impact of external shocks?
Obviously, COVID-19 pandemic especially hit industries where there's person-to-person contact, of which tourism is preeminent. And this won't be the last time we have a variant, and there may be other things that are related, so we need to think about it. So the idea that we should diversify away from tourism is at one level very attractive, and maybe a country like Jamaica, which has more or less 3 million people, could think about it. I mean, Finland's in 4.5 million. Okay, Jamaica is not so much smaller. So that's possible. Unfortunately, when we're talking about the Caribbean as a whole, most countries are much smaller, and it's going to be very hard to diversify away from that, one comparative advantage that we have. So I think we might need to think a little bit more about how to, what we'd say in Spanish, blindar, how to armor ourselves against things, crises like this again in the future. For instance, if we look across the Caribbean, some countries have recovered their tourist industry much quicker than others, and partly is because their health system managed to vaccinate their people much quicker and therefore make the country more attractive to travelers. In some parts of the Caribbean right now, it's quite active. And the DR, for instance, has had very healthy growth rates this year. So yes, diversifying is important, but we have to be honest about what's possible.
Thank you, Bill. We will continue with this question from Mariana Sánchez de Brasil. Ella nos escribe de la BBC News de Brasil.
And her question is, Brazil has shown better results, better than expected, especially with the emergency package. However, the predictions for 2022 are looking worse and worse. What is the status of the Brazilian economy, and what can we forecast depending on the politics? Well, the Brazilian economy did have a growth that was better than expected in 2021, and those are good news. We probably will reach 6.3%, which is above by 4.1% we lost last year. Additional, the deficit, I believe, dropped from 9.4% in 2020 to about 2% in 2020, by 2% in 2021. So obviously, that has something that has helped about, 88%. And so that's not much, but the growth forecast for 2023 is similar to what was forecast for the region. And so in 2022 is slightly lower, 1.7 lower than we anticipated. So of course, there's a lot of uncertainty, and these uncertainties can affect investment and therefore the growth. But once again, we should highlight that the region in general, and that includes Brazil, was not performing quite so well before the crisis in 2010. So we must focus in those structural problems in the long term, in addition to handling short-term uncertainty. Rafael Matis in Argentina from La Nación asks, what is the risk of a hyperinflation in Argentina? And I also like to link it to another question from El País, from the El Clarín in the United States. And the question is, what is the forecast in the short and long-term forecast for employment in Argentina? Well, I don't see that as a risk. Inflation belief is at 50%. I don't have that number handy, but the government is using different tools to avoid the worsening of the crisis. It has also reached an agreement with the IMF, and that has further reduced the risk. However, we are also discussing the short term. And once we have more stability and we lower the risk, we also face structural problems long term. Once more, Argentina was not having rapid growth in the last decade. All right. Paula Santibanez from Chile has the following question. How do you see the fiscal perspective in Chile? Well, we had very rapid growth in Chile this year. It was much higher than our loss in 2020, and obviously this is very good. Given the giant stimulus given in the year, the budget deficit is going to grow, and so that would talk about the economic recovery and the high copper prices. We hope that this debt wouldn't go into the scheduled commitments for budgetary growth, and that are the tools that the government has to manage this. Meanwhile, the emergency expenditures will be much lower. Irma Catizano from El Salvador, from La Prensa Gráfica, asks, how will El Salvador be able to handle the crisis, given that there's no agreement with the IMF? Well, El Salvador also had decent growth last year, and recovered a little bit more than it lost in 2020 with an 8% growth. And our projections show that the debts to finance institutions are covered in their budgets. Revenue came because of growth in the economy, and the fact that expenditures have decreased has also helped. I believe that the budgetary deficit will be lower in the GDP, so and that's for 2022. Nonetheless, there are financing challenges in 2022, and also perhaps for 2023. And an agreement with the IMF could lower that uncertainty. All right, we have a question from Mexico. Is still not recovering from the COVID-19 pandemic, but the central bank has increased their interest rate. What policies should be carried out for this recovery to occur in terms of politics? Well, in Mexico, we're expecting a 5.7% growth for 2021, which is much lower than the 8.3% in that we lost in 2020. And then the figures for 2022 and 2023 are quite similar to the region in general, for 3% by 2022 and 2.2% for 2023. So yes, we must find a way to accelerate growth. I would say that we have to slow down the new waves of COVID and try to get vaccinations to as many people as possible. We have to quickly increase that number, and that would be necessary. At the same time, Mexico could take advantage of their financial care last year, gives them a certain room to tackle some of those problems. For example, businesses and people that saw themselves affected by the pandemic. And I would also mention that we must lessen uncertainty in the private sector. And I would say that's important for the regrowth. Thank you, Bill. And now I would like to question the North Flores from Mexico. And this is something you've already discussed. And from El Universal, she asks, what are the expectations in Mexico? And how do you how will they handle the changes in 2021 and 22? This is what you were mentioning now. Can we go to the next question? All right. Alma Solis from Panama of SANA News, and she says, I would like to know what, according to you, would be the determining factors to the growth of for Panama. Obviously, when it comes to Panama, they had several blows, not only because of the lack of tourism and also transportation and aviation, and thus it depends very much in reactivating these industries. In the long term, we have many of the same challenges that Central America faces, more integration, better infrastructure, improving the quality of education. All of those are necessary to increase the growth rate in a medium range. So I want to remind everyone that the hashtag for this event is Perspectivas ALC, and we want to thank everyone here at this press conference. And now we have a question from Paraguay, from the Daily Intimadora. And we would like to say, what do you see for Paraguay? What is your forecast for the GDP for Paraguay for 2022? Thank you. Paraguay was one of the countries that did not suffer as much the global recession in 2020. I think their GDP fell 1.6%, and we expect the economy to grow by about 4% this year and another 4% in 2022, both of which are above the regional average. And this is driven mainly by the domestic consumption. And so at this time, the economy is operating at levels above pre-pandemic despite the drought and the impacts of export of farming products. But the economy is doing quite well in compared to others. And William Rios Rosales from Spain, the daily El Peruano, asks, how and do you see the perspectives in Peru? Well, obviously, in Peru was quite affected by the crisis, both in the number of deaths, but with the economy. Our forecast for the growth is 11.3% in 2021, and 3.2% in 2022, and 3% in 2023. All right. From the Dominican Republic, Mariela Mejia asks, what is the estimate that the increase on debt will affect economies in the Caribbean economies, such as in the Dominican Republic, due to the expenditures for the vaccines? Well, I believe that the Dominican Republic is an example of that, what a good investment it is to buy these vaccines, despite the way the budget. The economy fell 7% like other countries in the Caribbean, but this year we forecast a 9.1% growth, for 4.9% and in 2022, and another 4.9% in 2023. So obviously, yes, it was quite costly for them to purchase the vaccines, and the deficit has grown because of that. But the returns on this investment are quite good. At this time, we have to keep an eye on the deficits and the overall debt, but obviously this was a good investment. Thank you. Now we have a question from Argentina, from Daily AR. After the publication of the Pandora Papers, what is the impact of the offshore accounts in this in the economy? Well, as you might imagine, we have not calculated the impact at this time, but I thank you for the question, because the public information as to the holdings of public officials is a tool to try to promote transparency and to combat corruption, something that the World Bank takes quite seriously. So stay tuned, and we are providing support in the agenda to increase transparency and to promote exchange of information amongst jurisdictions, and to better the cooperation among countries and institutions, so that citizens can have and trust in the institutions. And we will follow that, of course. Thank you, Bill, and thank you everyone who's been here with us today in this press conference. And this will be our last question, shared by Santiago Gutierrez from Latin Fray. And his question is this the right time to convince Latin American companies that they are also responsible in the growth and development to improve their own skills and management? Hello, Santiago. It's nice to hear from you. And I think, midterm is very important to, like, as we say in the report, is that we are emphasizing about the management skills in this report is because those are extremely important both to improve the performance of existing companies, but also to start new ones. So the question would be why, if it's so important to improve this, if studies show that the return on investment to these trainings are so high, why is it that businesses don't do this on their own? I believe the answer to this question would be that businessmen don't know what they don't know, I guess would be the right way to say it. They believe that they're better than they are, and they don't realize what is it that they have to learn. So when you look towards Singapore, Scotland, United States, Japan, when you see the management extension or continuing education programs are used for that reason to address this asymmetry of information, but it's obvious that we won't have dynamic businesses unless we find a way to improve our businessmen. Bill, thank you very much. And this is our we're going to close now and thank everyone who was here with us today. And we can remind you now that you can find us through the hashtag #PerspectivasALC. We will be sharing the report shortly so you can download it and look through it. Thank you very much, Bill. Thank you, everyone. Thank you once more for being here with us. I am Jessica Belmont, Communications Officer for the World Bank. Thank you.
Recording stopped.